Russian capital of Moscow was the target of multiple drone attacks this morning, although Russia claims the damage caused was an insignificant one. No casualties were reported in the attack to several buildings in Moscow. The video that we are playing out on your screens show traces of smoke in the sky, and some even show broken windows from the buildings. It is, however, still not clear as to who launched these drone attacks. The Moscow mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, has said that all the emergency services of the city were pressed in to deal with the matter. The Russian Defense Ministry has also released a statement claiming that several of the drones were downed on their approach to Moscow. Now remember, this attack comes just days after a similar assault happened on Kiev in Ukraine, when Russian forces fired a barrage of missiles on Kiev, leaving at least one person dead. More importantly, these attacks are the second such drone attacks that have been acknowledged by Russia after the twin drone attacks on Kremlin only last month. Let me now bring in my colleague Sanjay Suri for more information on these drone attacks. But before we go to Sanjay, let me actually bring in the international affairs expert, Professor Scott Lucas, who's joining us on this live stream. Professor Lucas, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. The obvious question, who do you think really had targeted Moscow with these drones, considering Kiev has not really taken any responsibility for these attacks?
I think we have to be careful as analysts to say at this point, we have no confirmation who carried out the attacks. What we can do in the way of context is, as you noted earlier this month, there were two drones that were flown at the Kremlin, of course, in the heart of Moscow. And sometime after the attacks, both U.S. intelligence and a Ukrainian official said, yes, Ukrainian agencies were involved in that operation, even though it was not claimed at this time. Now, we must emphasize that as of this moment, no Ukrainian agency, and of course not President Zelensky, has claimed these attacks inside Moscow. You cannot rule out that it could be a group inside Moscow that would have the capability to carry this out. There is division within the leadership in Russia as the war is going badly. But no, I think we stick with this, as well as the facts that while several of the drones were downed, the Russian Defense Ministry says 8, at least 3 residential buildings were hit in Moscow. So the air defenses were not completely successful, which means that at least the symbolic level, whoever carried out these attacks, they did achieve the psychological task of showing vulnerability in the Russian capital amidst the problems that Russia has economically and militarily.
So, Professor Lucas, while you say that Ukraine has yet not acknowledged these attacks, but we have to also understand that these attacks are fresh on the heels of the Russian attacks to Kiev, which also resulted in the loss of at least one life. Ukraine would not be short of not showing their military might, considering there has to be a retaliation from their side. They cannot be seen as being sitting ducks. So don't you think there is an obvious claim that Kiev can make, considering these attacks have happened close on the heels of the Russian attack on Ukraine?
Well, oh, absolutely. And you're right to bring up the fact that the far more serious attacks, not only today, but of course throughout the 15 months of this conflict, have been the Russian attacks. So Russia only in this month has launched 17 sets of missile and drone attacks across the country, with a lot of them focused on Kyiv. What I think we need to note is, however, the difference in the types of attacks that are taking place. Today's attacks inside Moscow, again, are predominantly for psychological effect. They're not aiming at killing a large number of civilians. We're not talking about missiles that were used. We're not talking about the Iranian-made attack drones that Russia uses. The attacks that Russia's carrying out on Ukraine, those are designed to kill civilians. And indeed, they have killed civilians. Why are they doing that? Well, again, because Russia is in trouble on the battlefield, they're still trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people to defend themselves, which means that I think while the attack on Moscow was significant, it may be a one-off. Russia, albeit with diminishing capabilities, will continue to try to kill civilians across Ukraine, especially in Kyiv, with drones and missiles.
And Professor Lucas, these attacks are coming very, very close on the heels on the twin drone attacks at Kremlin. That again, the Russian authorities claimed did not really cause any significant damage. And very, very similar to that nature, we are seeing drone attacks and multiple ones at that, the capital city of Russia this time. Can we juxtapose these two attacks? And does it look like these are coming from a similar source?
I mean, again, without offering any conclusions on who carried out today's attacks, yes, I think a similar source for for launching these attacks is quite likely. Given, of course, that you're talking not just about one or two drones that were fired on Moscow today, that you're talking about at least 10 drones. And some reports are saying, still not confirmed, up to 25. What I would say here again, though, is that we need to understand why these attacks are being carried out. Ukraine has been told by its NATO allies, it's been told by the US, look, even though you're hitting Russian military targets, even though you're hitting Russian oil installations in preparation for your counteroffensive, don't carry out widespread attacks deep inside Russia, because that will give Russia the justification to say it's the victim here and not Ukraine.
Yes.
So I think these attacks, again, are psychological in nature, because Vladimir Putin, even as he's losing, will come out and tell the Russian people, I'm winning. I'm winning. This is our great success. This is our glorious country. And these attacks, at least at a symbolic level, show no, Russia is not invulnerable. Russia's not mighty. Russia's armed forces can't even protect its civilians from at least a few drones getting through in a daily attack.
Right. Professor Lucas, one final question to you, although this is a lesser popular opinion, because the Russian Defense Ministry has gone on to claim that these attacks were done by Kiev indeed. What about Belarus? Can we see a hand of the Belarusians in it? Because there have been several rounds where the Belarusian president, who is right now in the hospital, there are reports that are claiming by Belarusian leaders that he was indeed poisoned by the Kremlin.
Again, I would be really careful with this. So, for example, we had a statement by the Belarusian leader, Mr. Lukashenko, yesterday, if you believe it was by him, which called on other countries to join Moscow and Minsk in deploying nuclear weapons. Even there's no evidence at this point that Lukashenko was poisoned by the Russians. He has had health problems in the past.
Yes.
And I think the bigger thing that is still true is that Belarus is still hosting Russian forces. While Belarus has not put its own troops into Ukraine, it has enabled Russia to stage these attacks for 15 months. If Belarus was really serious about hurting the Russians, they would try to kick the Russian military out. And at that point, this isn't happening. So I'd put Belarus to the side at this point, unless we have some information that comes to the table which indicates a change in its position from being an ally to Vladimir Putin to being his possible attacker.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Professor Scott Lucas, for joining us on this live stream and offering your perspective on these fresh drone attacks at Russia, which the Russians are claiming to be done by the Ukrainians. Let me now bring in my colleague Sanjay Suri, who is also joining us on this live stream. Sanjay, any clarity of where could this drone attacks possibly have its origin from?
Well, we saw the border attack in Belgorod around Belgorod that he was referring to a minute back, and that was carried out by two groups that were hitherto unknown, the Friends of Russia Legion and the Russian Voluntary Corps. These are groups that are officially disowned by the Ukraine military, but clearly they have the backing of the Ukrainian military. Clearly they used armament and equipment that would ordinarily be available only to a military, and in this case to the Ukrainian military. Now, these are groups that have been operative and we know of their existence. There could be other such groups that have come up, and these are occupying an in-between space, because that space has become, as Ukrainian commanders see, necessary for them. They are constrained by an arrangement with NATO that NATO weaponry will not be used to attack Russia within Russia. And a number of commanders see that as an unnatural constraint. And I can tell you that a very senior commander of the Ukrainian military told me that on a visit to Ukraine not very long back. And this is an artificial constraint that they are struggling against. So what we now have are groups that are on the face of it independent, on the face of it disowned by the Ukrainian military, but carrying out operations that the Ukrainian military would like to see carried out, or in fact is itself carrying out behind the scenes. And it is clearly one of these two groups or a similar group that appears to be behind this new drone attack on Moscow, which of course opens a dramatic new dimension to the whole conflict.
Absolutely. So, Sanjay, where do you think this theory of this could be a hand of, some detractors from within Russia? Where do you see that theory really going? Because when we talk about Ukraine, like the last time when there were these twin drone attacks on the Kremlin, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was very quick to deny all of these allegations that were made by Russia. This time, there has been no response or no statement as yet by Ukraine.
We've had a statement from an advisor to President Zelensky saying that Ukraine has not carried out these attacks, but saying that Ukraine has watched these with pleasure and saying further that there will be more. Okay. So as you can see that the disguise is rather thin. And we have had a number of instances now of such attacks taking place. We remember, of course, the Crimea Bridge of October of last year, then the blast in Sevastopol on the oil depot, on the trains near the border. We've had a number of attacks being carried out, and the frequency of these is increasing. They're getting more and more bold, more and more daring. This new attack this morning on Moscow, clearly the most daring of the lot, even if not the most devastating. But this is a very symbolic blow, and it's a very strong signal to Moscow. So far it has been a given that Russians strike and they will strike Kiev, and in Kiev people think this now is routine.
Yes. That
the Russians will strike and they must hide and they must defend themselves. Well, the game is changing, that it is not the case when the Russians attack, it's an operation, and when the Ukrainians attack in return, it becomes a provocation. They clearly are determined to carry the fight back to the Russians, and there will be an issue here for NATO to address now on how far they restrain the Ukrainians from doing so.